Sacraments 101 is a series which seeks to highlight the 7 sacraments of the Roman Catholic Church and to give its listeners a better understanding of the outward signs instituted by Christ to give his people grace. Your program host is Father Jim Corda.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Sacraments 101. I'm Father Jim Corda. Today we're going to talk about the Eucharist, and joining me is Father Jack Lavelle. Welcome to our show.
Well, thank you for having me.
You know, when we talk about the Eucharist, we should begin with defining that word Eucharist. And once you do that, we're going to get into what we talk about the Eucharistic prayers. So define Eucharist, and then we'll get into our discussion.
Well, I think the most common and recognized understanding of the word Eucharist is translated into our sense of thanksgiving, our praise and thanksgiving of God for his abundant blessings, for his many gifts at work in our lives. And so when we talk about the Eucharistic celebration, while we might just see that, sadly sometimes we take Eucharist to be a literal translation of communion, body and blood. But that Eucharistic celebration really is an overarching celebration of our thanks, our praise, our appreciation of God's blessings at work in our lives. And the greatest irony is, even in our praise of God, it is He who continues to give us the greatest gift, which is His Son's flesh and blood, food and drink for the journey.
Now, of course, the Eucharist is made up of, or the Mass is made up of, the liturgy of the Word and the liturgy of the Eucharist. Today we're going to focus more on the liturgy of the Eucharist, primarily with the Eucharistic prayers. Let's actually define what the Eucharistic prayer is all about. Oftentimes people cavalierly say, well, it's that long prayer after you listen to the readings from the Bible, but it's more than just a long prayer. What's the makeup of the Eucharistic prayer, and where do we find its origins?
Well, again, if we want to look at the very beginning, and we'll spend just a brief moment on that, our very first understanding of a Eucharistic celebration, again, goes back to Holy Thursday and that sharing of that Last Supper with Christ, again, when he institutionalized the gift of the Eucharist along with holy orders. But he kind of set a pattern of this blessing, breaking, and sharing bread and wine. He did not formalize Eucharistic prayers then, but he did give us a narrative that becomes part of the Eucharistic prayers, which we'll talk about. But the Eucharistic prayers themselves would have been formulated over the years of the Church, as it even formulated what the Mass itself would become. Of the Eucharistic prayers, and we'll get into how many there are and the different ways, but if we were to choose one or pick one out, the one that we refer to with not a very unique title, Eucharistic prayer number 2, is actually the oldest, or believed to be the oldest Eucharistic prayer. It is the shortest, but it goes back to the time of Hippolytus, and it is understood that he fashioned and created that prayer to celebrate the Eucharist and put into place these components that he found essential to not only consecrating bread and wine, but fully developing that relationship that we are called to have with God. Our praise and thanksgiving of God, our prayer to God, God sending forth the gift of the Spirit and the consecration of the bread and wine, all of that wrapped up into this prayer. And then from that, the Church develops other Eucharistic prayers, but every one of them following a similar pattern.
Let's focus on the 4 primary Eucharistic prayers that we have in the Church. You had mentioned already Eucharistic prayer 2. I know for many priests, at least for myself, I'm very comfortable with that. With the change in the language several years ago, many priests had to become more familiar again with praying the Eucharistic prayers. And I think we become familiar with 1 or 2 of them. Let's go through the different Eucharistic prayers and what is different about each of them.
Well, again, for the 4 main Eucharistic prayers, we've already briefly spoken about Eucharistic prayer 2, which implies there's a Eucharistic prayer 1. It is the only one out of the four that also has another title. It is often referred to as the Roman Canon. So Eucharistic Prayer 1, just as you said, people will cavalierly refer to it as it's that long prayer, before we get to go to communion. There are many people who will see the Roman Canon as that very long prayer before we get ready for communion. It is steeped in more tradition of the early church. There is a greater reference to a multitude of saints, excuse me, both in the part before the memorial acclamation and after. Calling upon the apostles, calling upon early martyrs, really showing how important that early church's presence is. It also is the one Eucharistic prayer that has a variety of insertions. And by that we mean just special phrasing, unique to one Mass, unique to one celebration. So there would be for Christmas, for Easter, for the Ascension, for Pentecost, for Feast of the Blessed Mother, specific feasts. So in this basic model of prayer, you have all of these additions and insertions that really, I guess we could say, are more steeped in tradition, more steeped in the pageantry. And what is beautiful about that is, I would say that as we look at all the Eucharistic prayers, so we'll just look at 1 and 2 briefly right now, 2 the shortest. It gets the job done. 1, it gets the job done, but there's a lot more pageantry, a lot more mystery, a lot more majesty to it. You need both. And I think it is important, though I'm like you, I probably use 2 a lot, but I'm someone that believes that unless you sometimes have the absence of something, the presence of something doesn't make that solemnity or that event any more special. If your house was decorated for Christmas 365 days out of the year, what makes December 25th special? So I think even in the Eucharistic prayers, the fact that there isn't just one of them, it reminds us, even in our selection of them, that there are different importances that are derived in feasts. Never that the Mass isn't important, but we have to be honest. A Mass celebrated on Thursday morning of ordinary time with no optional memorial saint to be mentioned is not going to be the same and should not be the same as Easter Sunday, as Christmas midnight Mass, as Pentecost at 11 o'clock, in your parish church. So I think they, in 1 and 2, show a very stark contrast. 3 is probably a compromise candidate. 3 is a little bit longer. It has a little bit more of the mystery and the majesty, but it doesn't get into all the saints. It doesn't have insertions for holidays. One of the things that became important in the Eucharistic prayers, as we talked about in that change of the language a few years ago, was reconnecting them with their biblical roots. That is something that really had been taken from us and escaped what we were using. And some of the changes in language, I'll just want to point out something in Eucharistic prayer number 3 that really needed to be recaptured. In the old language, and just by conjuring it up, then you get confused, so bear with me. In the old language of Eucharistic Prayer 3, we would have said from east to west. And we wouldn't have thought much of it. But you and I went to a talk about that when it happened, and we had a bishop from Canada who said, up in Canada, some priests took it upon themselves to say from east to west and north to south, because those in the north and those in the south felt left out. Well, then it became directional. Well, in the new language, it's from the rising of the sun to its setting. Now, we understand that the sun rises in the east and it sets in the west. But what from the rising of the sun to its setting means is from the beginning to the end. It is this totality. And so some of those things got lost. So Eucharistic Prayer 3 brings a little bit more of that language to mind. And then Eucharistic Prayer 4, I would argue, is probably the least used. It is the one most steeped in biblical language. And oftentimes, even as I've researched it, should I be using it more, even experts have said, it's really one to be used when you're with a group of people that maybe have a little bit more understanding of Bible, of Scripture, of its place and placement in our lives, not just in the liturgy. So all four of them get the job done. All four of them have the same components from beginning to end, but each of them serve different purposes in the life of the church.
And we should remind the folks that are with us that all of the Eucharistic prayers have the same components.
Absolutely.
So when we have the calling or the invocation of the Spirit, or the breaking, or the intercessions, that's found in all Eucharistic prayers.
Absolutely.
We've got a few minutes left of our first segment. Let's briefly touch on some of the variety of the Eucharistic prayers that may not be well known to the folks that are with us, but then in our next segment, we'll talk more specifically about that.
Well, just briefly, we have the first four, but we also have two for reconciliation that are beautiful in their language and in their placement, in their proper placement in the liturgical year. There are four of what we call for various or special needs. And again, they all have the same components, but if you're celebrating masses with different approaches, different congregations, different needs, those have been developed. And then to a lesser use since the change in the liturgical language a few years ago are three Eucharistic prayers to be used with children. Not any Mass that has a kid, we have to be honest, but if you're having a school Mass or you're having a Mass of PSR or CCD students, those are there. And I think the Church, to show that they really should be more rare than they were being used, they are not currently included in the larger Roman Missal. They are in a separate book, where prior to the change in the language, they were in the sacramentary. The ones for various or special needs were not included. So I think just in its placement, we're trying to say, this is a little more rare, look at these four again.
You know, it's interesting because when you mention those other four Eucharistic prayers, and we call them prayers basically of the Church, way to unity, way to salvation, way to the Father, and the compassion of God. Those are really more specific about some theme or something that particular community gathering to celebrate Eucharist might want to lift up. But as a pre-celebrant, we were not always as familiar with those four as we were with reconciliation or the children's ones. And so it is important to kind of put those more into perspective. And we are going to talk primarily about some of those when we get back, but we're going to take a quick break. So please stay with us. We'll be back in a moment.
What have you done for your marriage today?
I gave my wife a hug this morning. I told her I love her.
Instead of sitting on the couch, I helped to clean up.
I cooked my husband's favorite breakfast.
I sent my husband a love email.
What have I done for my marriage today? It's a good question.
I gave her a call and say thinking of her and the kids.
I did her hair this morning. I think it looks pretty good.
We're going to the museums as a family.
What have I done for my marriage today?
I made my wife coffee and breakfast this morning.
It's going to be her birthday next week, so I've been spending time today making arrangements to make that extra special.
Oh, we're spending the day together?
I bought her an orchid.
Hassan was able to let me sleep in by taking care of him in the morning.
I read the newspaper to my wife, and it cracked her up. She's still laughing.
What have you done for your marriage today? Small changes can make a world of difference. Get started at foryourmarriage.org, a message from the Catholic Church.
By the time we can walk, each of us yearns for the joy that comes from being able to do for ourselves. Church World Service believes that being self-reliant is a joy everyone should share. So around the block or around the world, share the joy. Church World Service.
Doesn't your child deserve the best education possible? Then you should consider a Catholic school where strong academics are offered in a safe, disciplined environment, where education is deeply rooted in the religious teachings of our Catholic faith, where graduation rates are exceptional, where outstanding teachers help your child reach his or her fullest potential in the classroom and in life. But you should consider a Catholic school for the most important reason of all. Your child is worth it.
Welcome back to our show. I'm talking with Father Jack Lavelle on the Sacrament of the Eucharist. And primarily we're talking about the Eucharistic prayers. Let's go back to the Eucharistic prayers that we just mentioned prior to the break of reconciliation and children. Let's talk about reconciliation and when would the church use those and why would we use those?
Well, as we mentioned, even before the changes in the language of the liturgy around 2010, 2011, we had these two Eucharistic prayers for reconciliation. They, again, same components, same aspect of thanksgiving, of acclamation, of petition, all of them. It is important to note also that in all of these prayers, even with their different language, the one component that is exactly the same in all of them is the institution narrative. When Jesus takes the bread and says, and when he takes the cup, the chalice, and says, those words are exactly the same. Other words change in the different components. Those words are always the same. But we've had these Eucharistic prayers for reconciliation, perhaps to remind us of that need for reconciliation as we prepare to receive the Eucharist. When they should most be used, or I think when they are most commonly used, and even the Roman Missal recommends their usage, would be during the seasons that we think of as being penitential, Advent and Lent. Now, I know there are other characteristics of Advent, preparation, making ready, but we know that part of our making ready is purifying ourselves, making ourselves a more worthy vessel to receive that life-giving presence of Christ. So it's not just for Lent. Advent takes on that same characteristic. You know, there were a lot of people running around at different times saying, well, what color purple should you wear for Lent and what color purple do you wear for Advent? There's one purple in the church. It's violet. It's not based on what the church says. It's based on what color your religious goods store is selling that vestment in. And there's a variety of violets out there. But there's one violet because both of those seasons have a similar approach to that making ready. I mean, we make ready as much during Lent as we do during Advent. And again, part of that making ready is to really search our hearts, search our minds, prepare ourselves to rid ourselves of whatever is keeping us from loving God. And we have to remember also that connection to making ourselves worthy to receive the Eucharist. During Advent and Lent, we have penance services. We do that because we know we need to make ourselves ready for Easter. We need to make ourselves ready for Christmas. Well, what's Christmas and Easter? They're special seasons of receiving the presence of Christ. One in recalling his birth, one in recalling his resurrection. If preparation and removal of sin and seeking to be reconciled with one another is a hallmark and characteristic of those seasons, certainly it needs to be a hallmark and a characteristic of our receiving Christ in the Eucharist. We receive him no less anytime we celebrate the Mass than we do at Christmas or Easter. And so I think, though, during those specific seasons, a one-shot penance service might not accomplish it. That might be the actual act of reconciliation, but I think hearing the beautiful words, and they are beautiful, they are more steeped in some of the scriptural references to forgiveness. It talks a lot about our reconciliation with one another. It talks about accomplishing that goal of reunification with God and with others. Just a very beautiful reflection and meditation. One of the things I like about there being two of them is I always use them during the Advent and the Lenten season, and so you can switch on and off so that it's not the same thing for 40 days or the same thing for 4 weeks. And I'm always surprised by people who will take notice. The first year I did it, they were like, what's that Eucharistic prayer? What were you saying? What was that all about? Then the third year, it was like, boy, that's really nice. I was waiting for you to start using those. So that's where they have a very special purpose.
It's interesting that the Church would designate Eucharistic prayers for use at Masses with children. And as I looked at those Eucharistic prayers over the years, there's almost kind of like a more participatory action that's part of a back and forth with the celebrant and with the children. Explain that, and why is that an important facet of those Eucharistic prayers?
Well, and I think, and coming from a background where I also was an elementary school teacher before I went to seminary, the Eucharistic prayers for children, make no mistake, is not a dummying down of the adult Eucharistic prayers. It's, yes, we're putting it in language that they might understand, but it's the same components. It conveys the same message. Our catechists, when working with our young people, whether it's in school or PSR, CCD, are conveying that same understanding. They understand what petition is. They understand what calling down the Holy Spirit is. They understand the need to praise and thank God. They understand that these are the words that Jesus spoke. And even in the children's Eucharistic prayers, the Eucharistic narrative, the words Jesus spoke, are still the same. But it is so that they have a greater sense of engagement and understanding. The participatory act is put there for the same reason. To engage our young people. It's difficult sometimes for adults to simply be lectured to. But to engage our young people and to get them into this discussion and into this prayer becomes a very important aspect of the prayer itself. Now, I'd like to jump back, though, and help everybody understand just the language of the Eucharistic prayers themselves are written so that it is all of us praying to God. If you listen to the language, even though in the changes of the liturgical language a few years ago, where the creed went from being a collective, we believe this and we believe that, and became an I believe, I believe, I believe, making everybody take personal responsibility for their participation in the life of our Trinitarian God, the Eucharistic prayer retained the we. It is the voice of the celebrant, but it is one audible voice representing everyone present, and it is directed to God. One of the things I was taught in seminary was don't make a lot of eye contact with people during the Eucharistic prayer, because it's not for them. It's all of us praying to God. So, if you can't look up at God the whole time and you think it's going to look strange to the people that you've got your head in the cloud, that's why you look at the book. But it's not, I'm making eye contact with all of you. It's not a conversation between the priest, the bishop, and the people. It's all of us engaged in this conversation with God. Maybe that was seen or understood a little better in the old liturgy where everybody was facing in one direction. But even with the turnaround or the change, we still have to understand that concept that we're all in this prayer together. The participation of our young people helps them understand that even more, that they are part of this prayer. As you get older, you can understand one person's voicing it for all of us. When you're younger, you need to be active in that.
We're down to about 5 minutes of our time together. Let's go back. Earlier on, we were talking about different action words that really make up what the Eucharistic prayer is all about. And I would pull out maybe 4 different words. Breaking, sharing, handing over, pouring. There's these different action words that really make up what we are all about as Catholic Christians, but also what we celebrate in the sacrament and the life of the Eucharist. Going back to the first celebration of that at the Lord's Last Supper on Holy Thursday, we recall those words, even our scripture readings that are designated for that particular feast and celebration recall those different action words. Why is it so important for us to recall that the Eucharist, whenever we engage in that prayer through the priest, calls us to a life of action, calls us to really pour out ourselves, to hand ourselves over, to break ourselves in the sharing? Why is that important to do that?
Well, I think it is essential that we see what we are doing is this passing on. Generation after generation, we've been gifted with God's grace and God's mercy, God's very presence. I think it kind of goes back to when we've talked about other sacraments and the language we use. And sometimes we get tripped up in our language. So I would just use the example. I would argue that in all the sacraments, we need to do a better job of speaking of them in the present tense than in the past. And we all do it. I was baptized. I made my first communion. I was confirmed. We put everything in past historical connotations rather than I am baptized. Because the I am means I'm living it today. It wasn't the font on May 12th, 1968. It's today. I am making the gift of Eucharist alive in my heart. I am confirmed with the gifts of the Spirit. And I think we need that reminder in the Eucharist especially, because in the institution narrative, those brief words, it is historical. They are the words that Jesus spoke. So he took bread. We don't say, Jesus is now taking bread. He is now breaking it. He is now sharing it. We say, he took, he broke, he gave. All of those are in a past tense because we know that we're recalling what happened at the Last Supper. But we then move into language of sharing, pouring, breaking for us today. It has to be that ongoing action at work in our lives. If we are a people of the Eucharist, of that thanksgiving, it is not enough to have thanked someone 5 years ago. We have to, because you thank someone for the gift they gave you. If we want to take that very basic thing. If you gave me a gift on my birthday last year, I thanked you then. Now, I don't have to keep thanking you. It would be very odd that I think, I better thank Jim again for that gift. But God's presence in our lives is ongoing. His presence in our life isn't when I was born or when the day I was baptized. It's every day. His presence in our life, His blessings, His gifts, His generosity, His mercy, His peace, all of that is ongoing. So if it is happening every day, then every day we are required to be thankful for what He has done. And it puts it all in the present. And we know also moving toward a future. But that's why we can't see any part of that thankfulness, any part of that Eucharistic celebration as being the past. Yes, some stories are written in past tense. Yes, a few words are written in past tense. But the whole action is present. The whole action is ongoing.
And primarily, in closing, we would remind the folks that are with us that as Catholic Christians, we are a Eucharistic people. That is who we are. That is why we are. That's really the source and summit of our very existence in the life of Jesus. And so that's why we are encouraged to receive often the gift of the Eucharist. I thank you for enlightening us on that and sharing that information on the Eucharistic prayers. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
Sacraments 101 was a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program host was Father Jim Corda.